What if I told you that the Van Gogh you admire, the tortured genius who painted beauty amidst chaos, is a construct, a nearly mythological figure that he himself, in his most lucid moments of agony, would likely despise? What if we could peek through a keyhole into his life, not that of the art martyr, but that of the man of flesh and blood, with his smells, his habits, his cruelties, and his most common miseries? What would Vincent van Gogh, the man, not the myth, hate for us to know about his private life? The things he tried to hide beneath thick brushstrokes and vibrant colors. Brace yourself, because we are about to open a door that perhaps should have remained shut, to find a man far more complex, flawed, and for that very reason, infinitely more fascinating than the legend we've been sold. The first and most shocking truth, one that would surely make Vincent squirm in his grave to hear us discuss, is that he was, in many respects, a profoundly unpleasant man. Yes, unpleasant. And perhaps even that word is an understatement. Forget for a moment the image of the misunderstood dreamer, the ethereal artist who floated through the world in a cloud of poetic melancholy. In the reality of daily life, in close quarters, Vincent was an endurance test, an exercise in patience that few could withstand. He was stubborn to a point that transcended mere conviction and entered the realm of pathological irrationality. He was dogmatic in his opinions on absolutely everything, from theology to the proper way to grind pigments, and he possessed an almost limitless capacity for generating confrontation and unease. When an idea took hold in his mind, no logical argument, emotional appeal, or factual evidence could dislodge it. He became a steamroller of certainties, running over friends, family, and the few benefactors who dared to get close with an intensity that often bordered on verbal and psychological violence. Picture the scene, one that was repeated countless times in his life. A modest dinner, the atmosphere striving for a lightness that poverty already made difficult. Suddenly, Vincent, with his piercing eyes sunk into his angular face and his red beard in disarray, begins an impassioned monologue on the corruption of academic art, the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie, or the correct interpretation of a biblical passage. He didn't debate. He preached with the fervor of an Old Testament prophet. He didn't converse. He passed judgment. His voice would rise, his gestures would become abrupt, and anyone who dared to interject a differing opinion was immediately classified as an imbecile, a Philistine, or an enemy of the truth. This intransigence was not an occasional personality trait. It was the very backbone of his being, the rusted armor that protected him from a world he did not understand and which, in turn, had no desire to understand him. He brutally broke with his cousin and mentor, the painter Anton Mauve, one of the figures who had helped him most at the start of his career, over a disagreement about method. Mauve, with the best of intentions, suggested he practice drawing from plaster casts to improve his command of anatomy. Vincent, in a fit of iconoclastic fury, interpreted the suggestion as a mortal offense to his quest for the truth of real life, for the imperfect soul of humanity. His response was not a no, thank you. It was to smash the plaster casts, a symbolic act of violence that ended the relationship forever. This relentless search for truth, which in his art translates into a disarming and moving emotional honesty, manifested in his private life as a complete lack of a social filter, a chronic inability to navigate the minimum conventions of human coexistence. He was the guest who inevitably ruins the party, the friend who turns a casual coffee into an inquisitorial tribunal, the man who did not know how, or simply did not want, to yield a single inch of his ground for the sake of harmony. And he would hate for us to know this because, in his mind, he wasn't difficult. He had integrity. It was the rest of the world that was complacent. And this abrasive personality was wrapped in a physical appearance that, by the standards of his time, and let's be brutally honest, by ours as well, was often repulsive. Vincent was not just poor. He lived and embodied poverty in its rawest, most visceral, and, at times, most deliberate form. His personal hygiene was, to use a generous term, precarious. He was proud of his workman's clothes, worn out, patched, and perpetually stained with paint and who knows what else. He saw them as a symbol of his authenticity, a uniform of his self-proclaimed brotherhood with the peasants and the dispossessed. But this went far beyond symbolism. It was a sensorially aggressive reality. The letters from his brother, Theo, the patient and exhausted guardian angel, are filled with gentle pleas, almost begging. For Vincent to take a little more care of himself, to use the money sent to buy new clothes instead of more canvases, to keep his room in some minimal order, requests that were almost always met with disdain or simply ignored. Vincent saw asceticism as a virtue, a form of spiritual purification necessary for the true artist. He believed that to paint the miners of the Borinage, he had to live in a hovel more wretched than theirs. To paint the peasants of Nuenen, he had to eat worse than they did. The problem is that this choice, this performance of misery, had devastating social consequences. People avoided him. Neighbors closed their doors. Children, with the innocent cruelty unique to them, mocked him in the streets, treating him as the village madman. Long before any formal psychiatric diagnosis solidified his outcast status. His breath, often foul from a diet of bread, coffee, and tobacco, and from the decaying teeth he sometimes pulled out himself with pliers, made physical proximity a true challenge. He smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, cheap tobacco, and the sweat of someone who wears the same clothes for days on end. He was a man who carried on his body the odors of his trade and his neglect. And this olfactory aura erected an invisible but potent barrier between him and the world. It is one of the cruelest and saddest ironies of his biography. The man who desperately craved human connection, love, a family, a community, sabotaged any possibility of closeness with his own physical presence. He would hate for us to pry into this mundane and, to him, irrelevant facet of his existence. For Vincent, what mattered was the soul, the spirit, the art. But life, unfortunately for him, happens in the material plane, and his material self was a walking testament to his struggle, his stubbornness, and his profound, self-imposed isolation. Speaking of flesh and blood, we must venture into one of the most uncomfortable, murky, and revealing territories of Vincent's private life, his relationship with women and sex. He was by no means the incurable romantic that his passionate letters and vibrant art might suggest. Or rather, he was a romantic, but in a clumsy, predatory, and almost always frighteningly inappropriate way. His loves were projections of his own overwhelming needs, and his approaches were a masterclass in how not to court a human being. His passions were idealized constructs in his mind. He fell in love with the idea he had of women, not with the women themselves. The first major blow, which left deep scars, was with his cousin, Key Voss Stricker. Recently widowed and a mother, Key became the target of an all-consuming and obsessive passion from Vincent. He didn't fall in love with the real woman, with her grief and her responsibilities. He fell in love with an ideal of redemption, a symbol of the family life and normality that eluded him. Faced with her firm and repeated refusal, the famous, "No, never, not ever," his reaction was not one of respect, sorrow, or resignation. It was one of an obstinacy that bordered on insanity, a relentless pursuit that terrified the woman and shocked the family. In the most emblematic and bizarre episode of his stubbornness, he traveled to her parents' house, and when they refused to let him in, he held his own hand over the flame of a lamp, demanding to see her for as long as he could bear the pain. Obviously, this grotesque emotional blackmail did not work. It only cemented his reputation as an odd, unstable, and dangerous individual. He couldn't read social cues. He didn't understand the concept of personal boundaries. For him, love was a battle to be won by sheer force of insistence, a test of endurance and suffering, not a meeting of wills and affections. But the story that would surely make him blush with shame and explode with rage is his long and tumultuous relationship with Clasina Maria Hornick, better known as Cian. It is here that the narrative of the pure and misunderstood artist crumbles to reveal a much darker, sordid, and more complex reality. Cian was a prostitute, an alcoholic, pregnant with another man's child, and had a young daughter when Vincent found her, literally, in the gutter in The Hague. To him, she was the personification of fallen humanity, the real-life woman, marked by hardship and suffering, that he so desperately sought for his art. He took her in, gave her a roof and food, and made her his model and companion. At first glance, it was an act of almost Christian compassion, but the truth is that the relationship was a swamp of codependency, misery, and mutual exploitation. Vincent did not see her as an equal, as a partner. He saw her as a project, a redemption project for her, and above all, a self-affirmation project for himself. He wanted to save her to save himself. to prove to his bourgeois and religious family that he was capable of a love in its purest, most sacrificial form. However, their life together was a domestic hell. The poverty was abject, the small apartment was filthy and chaotic, and Cian's personality, shaped by years of abuse, alcoholism, and desperation, clashed daily with Vincent's emotional instability and dogmatic stubbornness. The fights were constant, ugly, and possibly violent. Theo, from Paris, pleaded in his letters for his brother to abandon this relationship that was destroying him physically, financially, and emotionally. But Vincent, in his characteristic stubbornness, persisted, driven by a toxic mix of pity, wounded pride, and a fascination with the sordid that he himself barely understood. The relationship ended disastrously, with Cian returning to prostitution, and years later, making good on one of her threats by committing suicide, drowning herself in a river. Vincent would hate for us to look at this story without the filter of nobility he tried to cast over it. He would want us to see it as an act of sacrifice, the artist who lowers himself to find human truth. But the raw, unvarnished truth is that it was a toxic relationship in which he used a vulnerable woman as an object for his artistic and moral ideals, and in the process both were deeply wounded. There is no glamour in shared misery, only pain and resentment. And this stain, that of exploitation disguised as compassion, is one he would have tried hardest to erase from his biography. His financial dependence on his brother Theo is another neuralgic point, an open wound that never healed and that, if he could, Vincent would hide from all of us under lock and key. The popular narrative likes to portray Theo as a dedicated and selfless patron, the saintly brother who believed in Vincent's genius and supported him unconditionally. And that is true, but it's only half the story, the beautiful half. The other half, the one that sanitized biographies omit, is that this relationship was fraught with unbearable tension, guilt, unspoken demands, and a deep, corrosive humiliation for Vincent. Every cent he spent was not a gift. It was a loan he knew he could never repay. Every tube of paint, every canvas, every piece of bread, every glass of absinthe was financed by Theo's exhaustive work in a profession that he, deep down, despised. Vincent was a man in his 30s, a grown man living on an allowance that placed him in a position of eternal debt and infantilization. He hated it. He hated it with all his might. His letters are a painful document of this dynamic. He desperately tries to justify his expenses, details his artistic progress like an employee reporting to his boss, and oscillates violently between moving gratitude and resentful anger. He felt like a burden, a failure, and in his worst moments, he would distill his frustration onto Theo, accusing him of not understanding him, of being just a picture dealer who couldn't comprehend the soul of a true artist. This dynamic became even more toxic with Theo's marriage to Johanna van Gogh. The arrival of a sister-in-law and later a nephew signified a direct threat to Vincent's only source of support. He saw Theo's new family not as a joy, but as competition for resources and affection. The fear of being abandoned, that the money would now be directed to the wife and child, consumed him. He felt jealousy, an ugly and petty jealousy. The inconvenient truth is that the great artist of freedom and emotion was, in practice, a financial prisoner. His creative freedom was paid for by the life his brother gave up living to the fullest. This unpayable debt was a constant source of anguish for Vincent, a daily reminder of his failure to fit into the world. This vulnerability, this humiliating dependence, is the opposite of the self-sufficient image every genius would want to project. And what about his relationship with other artists? The image that has been passed down to posterity, especially due to the episode with Paul Gauguin, is that of the socially inept hermit, incapable of collaboration. But the issue runs deeper. Vincent wasn't just difficult, he was a terrible colleague. His time in Paris, immersed in the circle of impressionists and post-impressionists, was marked by friction. He was too intense, too argumentative, while artists like Monet, Degas, and Pissarro debated the nuances of light and technique with a certain Parisian sophistication. Vincent would arrive with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, defending his views with a missionary's zeal. He didn't exchange ideas, he tried to convert others to his religion of art. Many simply found him exhausting. The debacle of the Yellow House in Arles is the ultimate example of this inability to collaborate. Vincent's dream was to create a community of artists in the south of France, an atelier of the south. He rented the house, painted it yellow, the color of hope, and prepared everything for the arrival of the first member, Paul Gauguin. Vincent idolized Gauguin, seeing him as a leader, but their living together was a disaster waiting to happen. Gauguin was arrogant, cynical, and domineering. Vincent was unstable, hypersensitive, and desperately needy for approval. Their discussions about art were pitched battles. The tension in the small house became palpable. The climax is well known: the fight, the threat with the razor, the self-mutilation of the ear, and Gauguin's flight. What Vincent would hate for us to know, however, is his huge share of the blame for the episode. The narrative often casts him as the fragile victim of an unfeeling Gauguin. But Vincent, with his suffocating intensity and his desperate need for validation, pushed the situation to its limit. He didn't want a colleague. He wanted a disciple who was also his master. He projected a series of impossible expectations onto Gauguin, and when reality set in, his psychic world collapsed. The dream of community turned into a nightmare of solitude, and the fault was not only the others. It was his own inability to relate in a healthy and balanced way. We arrive then at the most delicate and perhaps most explored issue of his life, his mental health. The label of madman has been so definitively attached to him that it has become part of his artistic identity. But this simplification is something that he, with his sharp intelligence and capacity for self-analysis, would hate. He was not simply mad. He was a man fighting a terrible illness, with the limited tools the 19th century medicine offered. Posthumous diagnoses vary enormously: temporal lobe epilepsy, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, absinthe poisoning, syphilis. What matters, beyond the diagnosis, is the lived experience. His attacks were terrifying. He describes in his letters periods of hallucinations, of an anguish so profound that death seemed like a release. During these crises, he was a danger to himself. He ate paint, drank kerosene. What he would not want us to know is how lucid he was in the intervals between crises. Therein lies the true tragedy. He knew he was sick. He observed himself, analyzed his own symptoms with almost clinical precision. He voluntarily committed himself to the asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, seeking help. He was not a lunatic wandering unaware of his condition. He was an intelligent and sensitive man, trapped in a mind that sometimes turned against him, and this awareness brought with it immense shame. The shame of the stigma, the shame of being a burden, the shame of not being able to control himself. The image of the genius painting in a frenzy of madness is a romantic myth. In truth, he painted in his moments of clarity as a way to hold on to it. Madness was the interruption, the enemy. He would loathe the glamorization of his illness. He would hate to be remembered as the mad painter, as it nullifies his struggle, his courage, his desperate search for lucidity through art. He did not paint because he was mad. He painted in spite of his illness, and that is a fundamental distinction. His art is not a symptom. It is a triumph of the human will over the abyss, and it is impossible to speak of his private life without mentioning his complex relationship with religion. Vincent was not an atheist. Far from it. He was raised in a pastoral home and in his youth was such a fervent evangelist that he was dismissed for being overzealous. This rejection led him to seek God elsewhere, in nature and in art. His vibrant brushstrokes are not just aesthetic choices. They are a theology. The yellow of his sunflowers is divine light. The deep blue of the starry night is transcendence. What he might not want us to know is how unorthodox and conflicted this faith was. He despised organized religion. His spirituality was almost pagan. He found the sacred in the mundane, in the ugly side of life, in a prostitute, in a peasant eating potatoes, in a pair of old boots. For him, art was a form of prayer, and this view placed him in direct conflict with the faith of his family. He saw himself as a martyr, not for Christ, but for art, which to him was the same thing. When we look at his body of work, without focusing on any specific canvas, we realize that all of this is there. The violence of his personality is in the brutality of his brushstrokes. His loneliness is in the way he painted empty chairs and solitary rooms. His desperate search for order amidst mental chaos is reflected in his rigorously structured compositions. The intensity of his feelings explodes in his colors. He was not content to represent the world. He wanted to make us feel the world as he felt it, with every nerve exposed. And that is the great and disturbing truth about Vincent van Gogh. He invites us to feel. But to feel as he did was a painful experience. To live with that intensity was unbearable. His art is the record of a sensibility so acute that the world became a constant assault. What for us is a sublime aesthetic experience was for him a 24-hour-a-day reality. And that reality was, for the most part, miserable, marked by filth, hunger, illness, rejection, and an overwhelming sense of failure. He sold only one painting in his lifetime. To the rest of the world, he was a nobody. So, what would Vincent van Gogh hate for us to know? He would hate that we have turned him into a saint. He would hate that we have cleaned up his story, smoothed his rough edges, and hidden his dirt under the golden carpet of his posthumous fame. He would hate the myth of the mad genius as much as he would hate the image of the sensitive, misunderstood artist. Both are simplifications that nullify the complexity of his struggle. He was stubborn, dirty, selfish, obsessive, socially inept, and at times cruel. But it was precisely from this raw material, from this imperfect and painful humanity, that he extracted a beauty the world had never seen. His art is not beautiful in spite of his flaws. It is beautiful because of them. It is his struggle, his pain, his anger, and his desperate hope that pulse in every brushstroke. Knowing this disturbing side of Vincent does not diminish his art. On the contrary, it makes it even more of a miracle. It shows that beauty can be born from the most unlikely of places. That greatness lies not in perfection, but in the courage to keep creating even when everything around you is falling apart. To look at the hidden face of Van Gogh is an invitation to be more honest about the nature of creativity and the human condition itself. It is the story of a man who went to hell and came back with a handful of stars. And that, let's be realistic, is a much more powerful truth than any myth.